million copies of 12 Rules for Life. You have 800,000 followers on Twitter, 1.4 million followers on YouTube. What is it that you're selling that so many people want to buy?
I don't think I'm selling anything.
Well, I went to a show where you were selling tickets to your show, so people are willing to pay a lot of money to see you speak. You know, what is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good.
Well, what is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, you know, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians and a reasonable amount of philosophy and a good swath of literature, and I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together. And I've tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults, you know, and I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women.
I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female. It might be about 50-50, but I think it would probably tilt more in the direction of female. Well, I can't tell how much of it is merely a consequence of the fact that YouTube skews so male. It might also be something to do with the call to take on voluntary responsibility. I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary for men right now. I think it might be because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. So, and it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them.
Well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, you know, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right, okay. So why? Why is order masculine?
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy?
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. You know, terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy. Well, it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence. No, but you might equally...
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who are usually part of the broad middle class, and who offer, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, our culture, our Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly in all of this?
Okay, well, let's go through it. I'm writing a book about feminism in the moment. Until 1919, there were professions that women were barred from. They simply were not allowed to do it. Until 1880s...
Why would you blame men for that?
Because who was in those professions, who was guarding entry to those professions? Your conception of patriarchy, as I see it in the book, is that quite a lot of men are quite nice and they do nice things for women. And
no, that's not my conception of patriarchy. And I don't require men or advise them to be nice, ever.
Well, you do talk about the guy who's the tampon king, the sanitary towel king of India, right?
I wouldn't call that nice.
Okay,
I would
what
call
would you...
that brave.
Okay.
Did you read about his life when he was trying to develop that?
Yeah.
God, it was absolutely miserable, and he did it anyways. He
Right.
freed all sorts of women as a consequence.
And I think
That's
that was...
not nice. That's courageous. That's noble. That's visionary. It's not nice.
I think it is also nice. I think it is also something that is, it is honouring your social obligations.
I'm not so sure that that's a social obligation, because many other people would have done it had it been a social obligation. He said what he was concerned about. He saw that his wife was suffering with her monthly period and had to choose between feeding her family and taking care of herself properly, and chose to feed her family and thought he would do something about that. That goes way past nice, especially given what he had to suffer through to do all the experimentation that produced his eventual technology. So, this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't. Go on.
Throughout history have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children with all the death that was associated with that. And to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy. It's absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
I mean, I absolutely disagree with you. I think that's like saying slavery in the US was actually, most people cooperated. Well, no, you didn't. You had a system where one set of people owned another set of people. And until women got full legal rights, they could own property for themselves, they could work. Essentially, they were owned. They were first owned by their fathers and then by their husbands.
Status to the domination by men.
Yeah.
You already said that you thought that what emancipated women primarily in the 20th century was technological revolution.
No, not primarily.
You're thinking instead it was the action of courageous feminists in the 1920s that produced a social revolution that overthrew the patriarchy. That's your theory.
Yeah, I think...
That's a foolish theory.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear you say that, but I think, to quote you in the Cathy Newman interview, I think it's a multivariate, right? I think there are lots of different things that all contributed to women gaining full rights.
Well, then let's not be assuming that Western society was a tyrannical patriarchy.
Well, no, but that's one of them, and then other things happened as well. So you have the pill, you have the dishwasher and white goods, labour-saving devices in the home. I think all of those were really important. But you also have things like campaigns for the vote.
Yes, you also have things like that, yes.
So
why would you even want to look at history like that? Like, what's your goal?
Because exactly? I think the people who don't look at history are condemned to repeat it. And I think that what
are we going to do? Repeat the persecution of women? You think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, we're sitting here.
How do you see that?
We're sitting here in America, right, where we've just had a 5th judge appointed to the Supreme Court who is now anti-abortion, who's now conservative. I think that abortion rights are absolutely fundamental to women being able to function as full humans in society, and I think that is now under threat in America. I think it is extremely smug and complacent to think civilization has peaked, it's all upwards from here.
Yeah, well... good luck with that, I suppose.
It's a living. There are lots of people who agree with me. There are lots of people clearly who agree with you.
There are just a lot of people, I would say, who are coming to listen to what I say because they're sick and tired of having their desire to move forward in the world and to achieve something and to take their place as adult males, let's say, who are under the weight of accusations that their ambition and forthrightness is a manifestation of something that's fundamentally tyrannical. They're not happy with that. It's not doing anyone any good, and it's also not true. It's really a terrible thing to do to young men. And it's happening all the time. That's why they're bailing out of universities like mad. There won't be a man left in the social sciences in 10 years in the universities, and it's no bloody wonder. It's an unhospitable place. And it's unhospitable precisely because of this doctrine. It said that throughout history, the fundamental relationship between men and women was one of power, essentially slavery. It's like, fine, believe it if you want. It's not going to do your relationships any good, I can tell you that. So.
Okay, well, we'll see how that one goes. I'm currently married, but I'll raise it with him. I think the universities example is a really fascinating one, because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And I've also seen you saying, well, you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe women...
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome, I think it's an unbelievably pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
and it's very dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support, but equality of outcome, it's...
So what's your problem with there not being...
confused beyond belief to support equality of outcome.
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university, right? Under your doctrine. I don't think that, but that's
I think
the logical extension of your doctrine.
It isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine, but I doubt it. We'll see.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the numbers of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive, and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable, mostly ratcheting up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering. And
see, this is where I find you fascinating to me, because you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that someone who will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender.
If that's what we were talking about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary wouldn't have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics types, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to, the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created.
Do you mean me as a woman or me as a 21st century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the project of politics is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy. You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
a progressive
That's a perfectly
means.
reasonable proposition.
But
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh, well, fair enough. But if
you could trade it off with someone who's less privileged.
I could.
That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Well, let me tell you my political philosophy. I'm I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, you know, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich. But what I do,
filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're
to...
probably in the top 0.1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not
so
sure that I'm
where
going
is the
to
line exactly?
be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life...
But I don't regard Western civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not.
Right.
And that's exactly the issue.
But why
because
would you deal with moral
when you describe it as a
absolutes
tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful.
Why
it's
is
not purely that at all.
I see it as one
then
element
why call
of
it a
many.
patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
And what if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like
Yeah.
the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. You know, they kind of...
And so if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of... They should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women and it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy, we're kind of out of options.
Right, but, well, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both
So
sexes
if
work.
it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
Everybody else in the middle.
One of the things that I've strived to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you've seen my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticized endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals and had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, in podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter's a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology.
I think I certainly agree with you. I think that's something that we agree on there. I think people are rarely at their best on Twitter.
No, and you know, I pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month. I don't think Twitter's been good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter that seems to really heighten the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are feeling irritable respond. You know, we don't know, like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly 1,000 people don't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. Like, we have no idea, right? Because it's a communication channel that no one understands. We're not evolved to understand it. We're not evolved to use it. Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never, ever do. And it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know. And it isn't.